He had asked plain in the letter for a plain, sturdy woman, a farm widow who could pull a calf and wring a hen's neck and not faint at a hard winter. And Boone Hatcher stood on the Antelope Springs platform in his one good shirt, watching the wrong woman step down off the noon train. She came down the iron steps in silk boots. Silk, the color of cream, buttoned up the side, with little heels that caught in the gaps of the planking, and above them a traveling dress of gray poplin, cut too fine for any farm this side of the divide, and a hat with a feather on it. She carried a carpet bag in one gloved hand and a stack of books tied with string in the other, and she looked up and down the platform with the bright, searching squint of a person who has read about a place but never smelled it. Boone did not move for a moment. He had spent good money on the fare. He had scrubbed the cabin and mended the roof, and bought a bolt of calico he'd been told women liked, and he had rehearsed, badly, the things a man says to a bride he has never met. None of it had been written for this. He took off his hat, because his mother had raised him to, and he walked over. "Ma'am," he said, "I think there's been a mistake made. I'm Boone Hatcher. I wrote to a Mrs. Alcott, a widow, about a situation. I am Mrs. Alcott." She set her books on the bench and put out her gloved hand as if they were meeting at a church social. "Beatrice Alcott. And I assure you, no mistake has been made, Mr. Hatcher, unless the mistake is one you are about to make with your face, which has gone the color of a beet." He shook the hand because it was offered. It was a small hand, and there was a callus on the side of the middle finger, an ink callus, the mark of a person who wrote a great deal. "You said farm widow in your letter," he said. "You said you could keep a house and manage stock." "I said I was a widow, and that I could keep a house and manage a great many things, which is the plain truth." She lifted her chin. Up close her eyes were a clear, unblinking hazel, and there was steel behind the city polish that he had not expected. "I did not say I was a farmer's wife, because I was not one. My husband was a schoolmaster in Ohio. He died of the lung fever 18 months ago, and left me his debts and his books, and no children to soften either. I have been teaching other people's children in a boarding school, where I was paid in room and contempt. When I read your advertisement, I did not think, here is a man who wants a mule in a bonnet. I thought, here is a man who wants a partner and does not yet know how to say so. If I was wrong, I have money enough saved for the fare back, and you may put me on the evening train and lose nothing but an afternoon." It was the longest speech anyone had made to Boone Hatcher in a year, and it left him with his hat in his hands and no ready words, which was a rare thing, for he was a plain-spoken man who usually had at least the ending of a sentence in view before he began it. He looked at the silk boots, already gray with platform dust. He looked at the stack of books. He looked at her face, which had not once flinched, and he understood that whatever he had ordered, what had come off the train was a person, and a proud one, and that he would sooner shame himself than shame her on a public platform. "I've a wagon," he said finally, "and a good ways to ride before dark. There's supper at the cabin if you're of a mind to eat it, before you decide anything. It's a plain supper. I have eaten plain suppers, Mr. Hatcher. I have eaten worse than plain." She picked up her books. "Lead on." The ride out to the ranch took the better part of 3 hours, the wagon jolting over ruts while the sun slid down behind the Antelope Hills, and the sage gave up its bitter green smell to the cooling air. Boone had meant to be silent. He was good at silent, but she asked him things. What the brand was, and why. How many head he ran, and how he watered them in the dry months. What the mountain was called that stood blue in the north, and whether the creek held trout. She did not ask the way a person makes conversation to fill a hole. She asked the way a person gathers facts she means to use. And when he answered short, she pried the rest out of him with more questions, until he found, to his own surprise, that he was telling her about the winter he'd lost 40 head to a blizzard, and had near lost the place, and that she was listening with her whole sharp face turned toward him. The cabin was 2 rooms, swept and cold. He lit the lamp and the fire, and set out the supper he'd left banked. Beans and salt pork and a pan of cornbread gone a little dry. He watched her take it in, the single shelf of his few possessions, The bed with its worn quilt, the water hauled from the creek, the whole hard, small honesty of the life. He waited for her face to fall. It did not fall. She untied her hat, hung it on a peg, as if she had lived there years, rolled back her cuffs over those ink-collared wrists, and asked him where he kept the coffee, because a supper this weary wanted coffee, and she would make it if he would point her at the pot. She burned the first pot. She had never cooked on an open hearth in her life, and she said so plainly, without apology, the way she said everything. But she watched how he raked the coals, and she asked, and the second pot was drinkable, and the third, 2 days on, was good. That first night she slept in the bed, and he in the barn, at his own offering, for he'd built no bargain that asked otherwise, and had told her so in the letter, that a marriage, if it came, would come when and if they both chose it, and not before, and that until then, she'd have the door, and he'd have the hay. She had looked at him a long moment when he said it, some calculation moving behind her eyes, and then she'd said that she had married once for sense, and once, she supposed, she might risk marrying for something better, and she would let him know. He lay awake in the straw a good while over that, listening to the wind, not sure whether he'd been refused or promised, and finding he minded the not knowing less than he'd have thought. That was the pattern of her. She could not milk, so she rose before dawn and learned, her brow furrowed and her fine hands raw with it, and she did not quit though the cow kicked over the pail twice. She could not ride, so she made him teach her, and she fell, and she got up with sage in her hair and a smear of dirt on her cheek, and got back in the saddle. What she could do she did at once. She went through his accounts, and found where the feed merchant had been cheating him by the sack. She wrote letters that got him a better price on his beef than he'd had in years. She taught the neighbor children their letters 2 afternoons a week, and was paid in eggs and butter, and the first real standing his lonely stretch of the valley had ever offered him. The town had opinions. Antelope Springs had watched the schoolmarm in silk boots step off the noon train, and it made its jokes, and it laid its bets on how long the fine city widow would last before she wept and went home. The worst of the talkers was Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the boarding house and had a daughter she'd once had hopes of matching to Boone, and who took it upon herself to tell the sewing circle that a woman who read Latin could not be trusted to salt a ham. Word of it got back, as such words do. Beatrice heard it out with her head tilted, and the following Sunday she carried a ham of her own curing to the church supper, salted and smoked and better than any on the table, and set it down beside Mrs. Pruitt's without a word, and let the eating do the arguing. It was not in her nature to quarrel where she could simply be right instead. Boone heard the jokes at the feed store and said nothing, because he had learned that a word from him only fed the fire, and because he had begun to notice that Beatrice Alcott did not last. She took root. By the second month she wore his dead sister's sturdy boots for the barn, and kept the silk ones wrapped in paper for church, and she could name every head of stock, and had opinions on all of them, and the men who had laid their bets stopped laughing when she outfigured the whole feed store on a grain contract in front of them. What turned it? What turned Boone, who had told himself all along that this was a bargain and not a courtship, came on a raw night in the fall. A norther blew in fast, the way they do, the temperature dropping through the floor between 1 hour and the next, sleet turning the yard to glass. A young heifer, one he'd meant to watch and hadn't, went into a bad calving out in the far pen. The calf turned wrong inside her. Boone found her down and straining and half froze, and he worked her alone in the driving sleet until his hands went numb past feeling, and the lantern guttered low on its last oil, and still the calf would not come, and he was losing them both, the heifer's breath going shallow, his own strength going with it. Then Beatrice was there. She had seen the light and come out through the storm in her nightdress, and his coat, her hair loose and soaked, and she did not shriek at the blood or the mess. She held the lantern steady, and then, when he told her what to do, she set her jaw and reached in alongside him with those clever ink-stained hands, and between the two of them, they turned the calf and drew it out slick and steaming into the cold, and it lived, and the heifer lived. They knelt in the mud in the sleet, both of them shaking, and Beatrice began helplessly to laugh, a real laugh, ragged and delighted. and Boone found he was laughing too. For the first time since the winter, he'd near lost everything. Back in the cabin, they stripped off the sodden coats, and Boone built the fire up until it roared, and Beatrice rubbed her frozen hands and would not stop grinning. And something had shifted in the small warm room that neither of them could put back. He had seen her fine and stubborn and clever with a ledger. He had not seen her elbow deep in a hard berth in the sleet, with her jaw set like a trap, and it undid something in him that all her softer arguments had not reached. "You're no farm widow," he said, when they had the calf dried and the fire built high and the coffee hot between their two chairs, the storm still moaning at the eaves. "No," she agreed. "I am a schoolmaster's widow who is learning to be a rancher's wife, which is harder, and which I find I would not trade." She looked at him over the rim of the cup, and the steel in her eyes had a softness in it now that she did not trouble to hide. "You wrote for someone sturdy, Boone Hatcher. I have decided to be the sturdiest thing you ever sent away for, but I will not be ordered like a sack of feed, and I will keep my books and my letters and my Saturdays with the children." "I never wanted a sack of feed," Boone said, and it came out rougher than he meant, because it was truer than he meant. "I reckon I wrote that letter because I didn't know how to write the real one. I wanted somebody to talk to across the fire. I didn't know I wanted somebody who'd argue back." "Then you are in luck," said Beatrice Alcott, "for you have got one." They married in the little church at Antelope Springs 3 weeks later, and she wore the cream silk boots, dust and all, because she said they had brought her to the right door and deserved to see the end of the road. The town that had laid its bets came to the wedding and ate her wedding cake. She had learned to bake it on the open hearth and burned only the first, and went home saying they'd known all along the two of them would suit. Years on, when a new bride stepped off the noon train uncertain, it was Beatrice who met her on the platform with a warm word, silk boots long since retired to a shelf but never thrown out. And Boone, watching his wife from the wagon seat, would think that he had asked the wide world for something sturdy and plain, and the world, wiser than he was, had sent him something bright and stubborn and dear, and had been right too. He had written for a woman who would not break. He had gotten one who would not bend the wrong way either, and who had chosen him, in the end, of her own clear mind, and there was no bargain on earth he would have traded for that.